What German soldiers did to American gays is unimaginable, not just because of the cruelty involved, but because of how long these stories remained buried in the dark corners of military archives and forgotten letters. When we think of the year 1842, we often think of a world in transition, a time of steam engines and westward expansion. But for those living outside the strict moral codes of the era, it was a time of invisible borders and deadly secrets. This isn't just a story about war. It's a story about the collision of two worlds, the rigid, Prussian-influenced discipline of the German military spirit and the fragile, emerging identity of individuals struggling to find their place in a young America. For over a century, the details of these encounters were whispered in shadows, suppressed by governments who wanted to maintain a pure image of their fighting forces. But history has a way of breathing through the cracks, and today we are uncovering the truth about what happened when the iron fist of old-world prejudice met the vulnerable souls of those who dared to love differently. Have you ever wondered how many heroes of history were forced to hide their true selves just to survive the very people they were supposed to call brothers in arms? Comment "Truth matters" if you believe every voice deserves to be heard, because today we are breaking the silence on a chapter of history that was meant to be erased forever. To understand the gravity of 1842, we have to understand the atmosphere of the time. Germany, as we know it today, was a collection of powerful states, with Prussia leading the way with a military machine that was envied and feared across the globe. This machine wasn't just built on gunpowder, it was built on a code of moral purity that left no room for deviation. When German influence began to spread, it brought with it a legal and social intolerance that would eventually codify into laws that haunted Europe for generations. But what happens when that rigid ideology crosses the Atlantic? What happens when American soldiers, or those living within the American sphere, found themselves at the mercy of a system that viewed their very existence as a biological crime? The stories coming out of this period are chilling. Accounts of secret tribunals, public shaming, and cleansing rituals that were designed not just to punish, but to obliterate the dignity of the individual. Neil Diamond might have sung about the star of hope in America, but for the men in this story, that star was often obscured by the smoke of intolerance. As we dive into the specific accounts of the soldiers involved, you will see a pattern of behavior that set the stage for the horrors of the following century. This was the blueprint for persecution. But amidst the darkness, there was also a staggering amount of courage. Men who, despite the threat of the stockade or the firing squad, refused to let their humanity be extinguished. Why has this been kept out of our history books for so long? And what was the specific event in 1842 that sent shockwaves through the military ranks? Stay with me, because as we peel back the layers of this unimaginable history, you'll realize that the battle for freedom wasn't just fought on open fields, but in the quiet, desperate struggle to be seen and known without fear. Here is part 2. We are moving into the heart of the conflict, exploring the rigid Prussian military codes that influenced these encounters and the specific methods of psychological and physical suppression used during this era. The unimaginable nature of what occurred in 1842 stems from a clash of two very different military philosophies. At the time, the American military was still finding its identity, a ragtag collection of volunteers and professionals. But the German influence, specifically from Prussia, was beginning to seep into the ranks of global warfare like a cold, relentless fog. The German military code of that era didn't just demand physical obedience, it demanded a total standardization of the soul. To the high-ranking officers who brought these ideals across the ocean, any form of nonconformity, especially regarding sexuality, was seen as a rot that could topple an entire empire. In 1842, a series of secret crackdowns began within military encampments where German mercenaries and advisors held sway. They implemented a system of internal purification that treated American soldiers suspected of being gay not as men who had broken a rule, but as errors in nature that had to be brutally corrected or removed. What makes this chapter so haunting is the psychological warfare used against these individuals. It wasn't just about physical imprisonment. It was about the total destruction of a person's reputation and spirit. In the cold, damp barracks of the frontier, soldiers were subjected to interrogations of conscience, where they were forced to name others under the threat of being branded with the mark of infamy. The German officers, obsessed with the concept of Mannesstamm, the purity of the male lineage, believed that by publicly shaming one individual, they could scare the deviants out of 1,000 others. Imagine being a young American soldier thousands of miles from home, only to be dragged before a tribunal that didn't speak your language of liberty, but spoke only the language of absolute, iron-fisted conformity. If you think that no person should ever be punished for who they are, write human dignity in the comments, because the men of 1842 were the first to face a machine that was designed to turn humans into unthinking, unfeeling cogs. The specific unimaginable acts often involved a ritual known as the social death. A soldier found guilty of these crimes was not simply discharged. In several documented cases from that period, they were subjected to a public stripping of their rank in front of the entire regiment, followed by a forced march through a gauntlet of silence, where their former brothers in arms were forbidden from even looking at them. This wasn't just a punishment, it was an attempt to erase their existence while they were still breathing. Many of these men were then turned over to local authorities or simply abandoned in the wilderness without supplies, a death sentence in all but name. Neil Diamond sang about America being a star of hope, but for these soldiers, the star had been extinguished by a foreign ideology that valued the uniform more than the man wearing it. But why did the American leadership allow this to happen? The truth is a bitter pill to swallow. The young US government was so desperate for the tactical expertise of the German military elite that they turned a blind eye to the moral cleansing taking place in their own camps. They traded the lives and dignity of their soldiers for the blueprints of European warfare. But as the winter of 1842 set in, one particular case involving a young lieutenant began to leak out to the public, threatening to expose the entire system of cruelty. Stay with me for the next part, because we are going to look at the silent letter that almost brought down a colonel and the shocking revelation of what was found in the secret archives that changed our understanding of the 19th century military forever. Here is part 3. In this section, we delve into the breaking point of this systemic oppression, the story of a brave individual who refused to disappear, and the secret correspondence that almost exposed the military's darkest secret. The turning point of 1842 came not from a battlefield, but from a single blood-stained letter that managed to bypass the censors of the Prussian-led tribunals. While the German officers believed they had successfully silenced the deviants within the ranks through their rituals of social death, they underestimated the power of the American spirit to resist foreign tyranny. This is the story of Lieutenant William Harrison, a name that was nearly scrubbed from every official record. Harrison was a young man of high standing, but he had a secret that the German advisors deemed a sickness of the soul. When he was caught in an indiscretion with a fellow private, the German Colonel von Brandt didn't just want him court-martialed, he wanted him obliterated as an example to the entire American frontier. The unimaginable treatment that followed involved Harrison being kept in a subterranean cell for 22 days without light, subjected to moral re-education sessions that were nothing short of psychological torture. But Harrison was smarter than his captors. Using a piece of charcoal and the lining of his military tunic, he wrote a desperate plea to his brother, a lawyer in Philadelphia. In this letter, he detailed the German Inquisitions taking place on American soil, describing how German officers were bypassing American law to enforce their own brutal, old-world prejudices. He wrote, "They do not seek to punish my actions. They seek to hollow out my very heart so that only their shadow remains." If you believe that a person's private life should never be used as a weapon of war against them, comment "Justice for the Brave" below, because William Harrison's letter was the first spark in a fire that would eventually demand the protection of every soldier's dignity. When the letter reached the outside world, it sparked a silent panic within the high command. The American government was caught in a trap. If they defended Harrison, they risked offending their powerful German military allies. If they ignored him, they admitted that American soil was no longer governed by American values. The response from Colonel von Brandt was to accelerate the cleansing. He ordered a secret night of the Brazen Eagle, where all suspected soldiers were rounded up in the dead of night, stripped of their identities, and prepared for a mass expulsion that would have sent them into the winter wilderness to die. This was the moment where the unimaginable became a cold, hard reality. The German soldiers, acting under a code of absolute obedience, carried out these orders with a chilling mechanical precision that horrified the local American volunteers who witnessed it. What happened next is one of the most suppressed moments in 19th century military history. As the gates of the camp were about to be opened for the expulsion, a group of American infantrymen, moved by the sight of their brothers being treated like cattle, did something unthinkable. They lowered their bayonets not at an enemy, but at the German guards. A standoff ensued that threatened to ignite a civil war within the camp itself. Why haven't we heard about this mutiny of mercy? And what was the ultimatum of 1842 that finally forced the German advisors to change their tactics? Stay with me for the next part, because we are going to reveal the shocking compromise that was made in the halls of power, a compromise that protected the purity of the army at the cost of thousands of lives over the next century. This is where the shadow of the past meets the light of the present. Here is part 4. We are now entering the dark heart of the institutional cover-up, where the mutiny of mercy was silenced by the high command and a secret pact was forged that would haunt the military for the next 100 years. The standoff at the gates in the winter of 1842 was a moment where the American soul flickered with a light of rebellion. But the shadows of power were far more organized than the soldiers' sense of justice. When the American infantrymen lowered their bayonets against the German guards, they weren't just defending their friends, they were defending the very idea of American liberty against a foreign, iron-fisted ideology. However, Colonel von Brandt and the high-ranking U.S. officials knew that if word of this internal civil war leaked out, it would destroy the military's credibility and jeopardize the essential tactical training provided by the Prussians. In a matter of hours, a blackout order was issued. The American soldiers who stood up for their brothers were reassigned to the most dangerous, isolated frontier posts, effectively scattering the witnesses to the wind. The unimaginable truth was that the government chose to sacrifice its men's lives to save its own reputation. To bury the scandal of Lieutenant William Harrison and the night of the Brazen Eagle, the German advisors helped craft a new, secret set of regulations. These weren't public laws, but gentlemen's agreements that allowed for the quiet, systematic removal of anyone deemed socially incompatible. They stopped the public shaming rituals that had sparked the mutiny and replaced them with something even more terrifying: the invisible discharge. A soldier wouldn't be beaten or marched through a gauntlet. He would simply vanish from the rolls, his records burned, his name erased, as if he had never served the country he was willing to die for. This was the birth of the don't ask, don't tell mentality. But in 1842, it was enforced with the cold, calculated efficiency of the Prussian machine. If you think the memory of a soldier should be honored regardless of their secrets, comment never forgotten, because we are finally reclaiming the names that the 1842 cover-up tried to erase. The long-term consequences of this collision of ideologies were devastating. By allowing the German moral purity codes to influence American military structure, the US essentially imported a virus of intolerance that would persist for generations. Historians have recently uncovered diaries from this period that describe the living ghosts, men who lived in constant fear of a single word from a German-influenced superior. One diary, found in an attic in Virginia, belonged to a soldier who witnessed the aftermath of 1842. He wrote, "The Germans taught us how to march in a straight line, but they also taught us how to look at our brothers with suspicion. We gained a professional army, but we lost a piece of our heart." The unimaginable part isn't just the physical cruelty, it's the fact that this foreign prejudice was woven into the very fabric of the American military, becoming a tradition that would take over 150 years to dismantle. But what happened to Lieutenant Harrison, and what was found in the Vault of Silence in Berlin after the walls of history finally came down? As we move into the final part of our story, we will reveal the shocking discovery made in the late 20th century that proved Harrison's letter wasn't the only one. There were hundreds of them, a hidden archive of love and defiance that the military tried to burn, but the fire of truth was too strong to put out. Stay with me for the conclusion, because the final revelation about the soldiers of the shadow will change the way you look at every military monument in the country. This is the moment where the unimaginable finally becomes understood. Here is part 5, the final chapter of this investigation into the hidden history of 1842. We conclude with the modern-day discovery of the Vault of Silence and the final restoration of the dignity of those who were erased. The final layer of this unimaginable history remained buried for over a century, hidden within the Vault of Silence, a collection of classified military files that moved from the Prussian archives in Berlin to secret storage in the United States after World War II. For decades, historians believed that the story of the 1842 crackdowns was nothing more than a localized rumor, a ghost story of the frontier. But in the late 20th century, a researcher stumbled upon a series of crates marked with a seal that had not been opened since the mid-1800s. Inside were not just maps or tactics, but the personal effects of the men the German-influenced tribunals had tried to erase. There were lockets, pressed flowers, and most importantly, hundreds of unsent letters. It turned out that the invisible discharge wasn't just a removal of rank. It was a systematic confiscation of identity. The military had kept these items as evidence of deviance, inadvertently creating a time capsule of the very humanity they sought to destroy. Among these files, the final fate of Lieutenant William Harrison was finally revealed. He didn't die in that subterranean cell, nor did he perish in the wilderness. The records show that after the Mutiny of Mercy, Harrison was forced to sign a document renouncing his citizenship and his service in exchange for his life. He spent the rest of his days living under a pseudonym, working as a simple farmhand, never allowed to speak of the uniform he once wore with pride. But in his final letter to himself, found in those dusty crates, he wrote a sentence that serves as a haunting epitaph for all the soldiers of the shadow. "They can take my name, they can take my rank, and they can bury my words, but they cannot take the fact that I stood for my country when it was afraid to stand for me." If you believe that history should finally honor every soldier who served in silence, comment, "Rest in honor," because the truth is finally coming home. The unimaginable acts of 1842 served as a dark blueprint for over 150 years of military policy. The German influence of that era taught a young American military that cohesion required uniformity of the soul, a mistake that cost thousands of men their careers, their families, and their lives. But as we look at this history today, we see that the real rot wasn't the individuals being persecuted. It was the prejudice imported from a dying old-world empire. Today, the names found in the Vault of Silence are slowly being added back to the rolls of honor. We are realizing that the American star that Neil Diamond sang about only shines because it is composed of every single light, no matter how much the shadows tried to dim them. This story of 1842 is a reminder that the battle for freedom is often fought in the most private corners of the human heart. The German soldiers and the American officers who followed them thought they were building a stronger army by removing the different, but they only succeeded in hollowing out the very values they claimed to protect. As we close this chapter, let us remember that the greatest strength of any nation and any military is not its ability to enforce conformity, but its courage to embrace the humanity of those who serve it. The unimaginable is no longer a secret. The silence has been broken, and the soldiers of the shadow are finally stepping into the light where they belong.